Hello there, Capital H listeners. I'm your host, David Mallon. I'm a managing director in our U.S. Human Capital practice, and I lead our Insights to Action Research and Sensing team. Today, we have two very familiar voices to those of you who are frequent pod listeners, Franz Gilbert and Matt Shannon. They are the voices of our HR Market Insights series here on Capital H. Franz and Matt, please say hello and do a quick re-intro for our listeners.
Hey everyone, it's a pleasure to be talking with you all again. For those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Franz Gilbert. I'm a partner with Deloitte, and I lead our human capital ecosystems and alliances, both globally and for the U.S. member firm, and also sit on the board of the HR Certification Institute. Matt?
Thanks, Franz, and thanks again for having us, David. Matthew Shannon, Program and Capability Manager for our Human Capital Ecosystems and Alliances team. Very excited to be continuing this series on HR Market Insights here on the Capital H podcast.
Well, great. Thanks for coming back and chatting with our listeners. Thank you both. Let's get started. So, by all measure, you both have been very busy in the last little while, engaging with over 300 technology vendors across the HR spectrum, at least a dozen conferences as far as we can count in the last cycle, sat down with product and technology officers from some of the leading organizations around the world. And obviously, particularly useful for our listeners today, you've shared those insights collected across all that activity in a report that you've recently published, Deloitte's 2025 HR Technology Marketplace Predictions. Let's start with just tell us a bit more about the report. Why is it so important? What's interesting about it? Matt, take us away.
Yeah, glad to. So we certainly know, and by sharing some of those metrics of the exposure that our team has, that the HR tech marketplace is one that's rapidly expanding, difficult and challenging for both buyers and users to navigate. As we mentioned, we track hundreds of providers in this space. We look at 55 specific product categories that we know as most relevant for the large enterprise and mid-market businesses that we primarily support at Deloitte. Add to that the wealth of startups and providers that target small business owners. There's really thousands of options to consider in this marketplace. Oh, and by the way, I also like to hear many of the same things coming from these unique providers, phrases and marketing campaigns and in their product demos that they know are buzzworthy and they know grab attention of prospective buyers. These are examples like generative AI, agentic AI, skills-based organizations, talent intelligence. Well, these are all things that factor into our analysis. And I like to think about our report as a translation of what's all that hype in the marketplace and how do we bring the perspective to cut through that noise and understand what to expect in the year ahead.
So it certainly sounds like it's a busy market, but to your point about sort of, hype from reality, buying behavior, et cetera. Franz, one of the 6 predictions you talk about in the report is focused on market funding and in particular anticipated merger and acquisition activity. So how do you see M&A activity and investment funding in general playing out in the HR tech space in this next year? What's going to determine the direction it takes?
A couple of different pieces. And I think to tag on what Matt just said, I think it's important that the listeners understand that what you're hearing from Matt and I is how we look at the market and the way Deloitte looks at the way we look at firms from a partnership perspective, right? So what their product does today is interesting, but candidly sometimes not even important. It's really what's their long-term strategy. And that's what Matt and I, when we go do these market studies, really are looking at is, where do we see that changing? And so on the M&A side, David, what's really interesting is this, to some extent, has not a lot to do with that. It's human capital. It has to do with the SaaS side, specifically within the HR tech space. I think everyone's aware, there was a constraint of funding over the last 2.5 years, right? There was, a lot of companies were having trouble with cash flow, the investment pipeline slowed down. And think of it as kind of a snake, right? Where, the private equity shops, the VCs, they have a lot of assets under management and they haven't been able to flip, in terms of PE, or they haven't been able to take companies to the next round of funding to get out their previous investors. And so there's this backlog, and just give you an idea, in the public markets, there are more companies that are ready to go public than the public markets can support, right? So there's kind of this issue going on. And so 2 things are happening. A is in terms of, as a result, you've got a bunch of firms that may have not been able to manage their cash flow, their sales may have been down. So there's a lot of opportunities in that regards to go out and say, okay, how do I get those firms, right? More kind of fire sale type transaction. There's also a bunch of firms that are going out and they're called A+ rounds, but basically what they're able to do is, get a premium for how they perform. And so let me just give a little bit of context on this. In terms of acquisitions, so in 2023, there were 64 acquisitions in January, February. We're recording this, the first part of March, right? So kind of 2 months. In 2024, there were 60. In 2025, we're already at 75 acquisition transactions in the HR technology space. So just to give you a sense of magnitude of what's happening. Now let's talk about the funding. This is where and David, I hope you don't mind me doing this, but it really paints an amazing picture. Is in 2023, in January, February, there were 99 funding rounds that were done. 2024, there were 74. In 2025, there's only been 31. So, we're 1/3 of what we were 3 years ago. But here's the fascinating piece, is that in terms of average size of those rounds, in 2023, it was $5.7 million. Now we're at $14 million rounds is kind of the average across those 31. So what's happening is we're seeing less frenetic activity, right? Of let's go through a bunch of small rounds at a bunch of smaller firms, but we're seeing very concentrated fundings on great firms that are providing investor value. So there's a lot of the economic piece going on, right? That's kind of driving a lot of the activity. The second piece is that human capital is one of the more popular spaces from an investment standpoint, because investors know this is where there's a lot of spin coming in, right? Many of the analyst community have seen an uptick in HR tech investment by, CHROs across. So we know there continues to be pull here too. And so when we talk about the trends and why this matters is from a client perspective, you need to be thinking as you're looking at providers, not only looking at what their tech does for you today, but understand that underneath all of this are some very strong investment trends that could affect the provider that you're selecting. And that's why working with Deloitte, you get the value of Matt and I's perceptions along with, amazing analyst teams. David, I know you get to do that a lot, and all the way down to our teams to actually implement the software.
One of the areas that's generating a particular level of attention, and maybe part of this question is how much is this, again, reality versus hype, but that is agents and agentic AI. Franz, I'll stay with you. How are agents coming to HR technology? Are they coming to HR technology in 2025? Are there particular trends, advancements, movements in general that you think are, again, determinant of how much this becomes a real thing?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I mean, I think, it's just for everyone, the listeners, when you think about agentic AI, in an easy way, or at least, kind of the way I think about it, and this is oversimplifying it, but basically you have a large language model that you can talk to, right, in terms of typing or asking to interrogate. And then underneath it, you have what was kind of traditional RPA, robotic process automation. It's basically you can talk to a chatbot. It then can trigger APIs, right? So agentic AI allows a system to kind of, based on your question, know which APIs to call in, right? So on one hand, and I hate to say relatively simplistic technology because it's amazing that this didn't exist 14 months ago, but it exists now, right? The question everyone's kind of racing to is, in-system agentic AI. So, if you're an HCM, a bunch of the HCM providers have done an amazing job announcing their agentic AI, right? And there's some amazing use cases out there. One of my favorite ones is like onboarding. Where you go, how do I take this and really make something where you're tying across many things across inside of an HCM? That piece makes perfect sense, right? And we're really excited at that be coming to market. The second piece is cross-system agentic AI. And that's where the complexity starts kicking in, where you're going, okay, I may be talking to, my help desk versus my HCM versus my learning system. We in HR know that, a lot of our self-service activities are life events, so somebody gets, married. Well, there's a lot of things that trigger across all the various systems. And, so the agentic AI may be talking to lots of different systems. And there you run into a couple challenges of just one, how do you maintain the compliance of those systems? In terms of, are you getting the right security permissions? Or is the activity actually following the laws? Like if you have somebody request a leave of absence, it may be doing it great in the Ben admin system, but in the workforce management system, it may not be following like the state and local regs. So there's an open question of how do we maintain compliance that is out there. The second is, how do you actually track all of these agents, right? Just from a control standpoint. And one of the big HCM providers just announced an agent of record system, which we know is going to be an important component of anybody's tech stack. Because once you have all these agents running, we are going to have an inventory of what are they doing? What are the controls behind them? And also from a maintenance perspective. I mean, as you can imagine, every one of these, this is one of the challenges that we had in the RPA world was, as data fields changed or workflows changed, you had to update RPA. The question is, how hard and easy is that going to be in agentic? So I fully expect the industry going to do a lot of experimentation here in the next year. A lot of folks have already put flags in the sand that they are going to be doing. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how much we actually see rolled out in production, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now.
Matt, the picture that Franz is painting is one of very simple in concept, perhaps much more complicated in implementation. How do you suggest organizations prepare for bringing agents into their HR processes?
Yeah, I appreciate this question, especially since we're talking about agentic AI, when many organizations that we support are really still figuring out and working through generative AI from the last 2 years. Franz, you mentioned the 14-month time horizon. In fact, it's from our state of AI and enterprise research, we know that forecasts for this year, 25% of companies that use generative AI today will launch agentic AI pilots and proof of concepts in 2025, with an expectation that number will double by 2027 to 50%. Now, companies in thinking through agentic AI use cases with HR technology should start by not just looking at the technology and what it can do, but looking at the work, prioritizing the right workflows, and identifying, as we'll get into in an additional prediction today, the tasks that can be automated in a particular sequence, and then redesigning that workflow for efficiency of operations, but also for intended user experiences on both sides of executing work, but also the talent in our organizations today. Franz had mentioned onboarding as a preferred use case. I like talent acquisition in general, thinking through a lot of the familiar use cases that anyone goes through in getting a new job. Imagining sequences where maybe a hiring manager opens up a new position, potentially looks at active and passive candidates as potential fits. It's an agentic hiring suite that can then send initial outreach to individuals, correspond with their responses, qualify their interests and criteria of a fit for a specific role, go through the process of scheduling, rescheduling with the recruiter, and then tying in, as mentioned, not just agentic, but generative use cases of summarizing interview notes, summarizing feedback from slates of interviewers for consistency in hiring and candidate interview experiences, and then all offering feedback to the participants along the way. A lot of steps involved in that sequential nature, a lot of logical flow and execution of tasks across the systems, but that's what makes agentic a capability, a story that's really worth compelling. I think the other aspect that I'll tie into in terms of preparations is considerations around data governance and cybersecurity. How do we ensure strong regulations and guardrails and the processes that we're entering into with agentic capabilities? And a balance is critical here between the risk and reward. So starting with the workflow processes, but also understanding that maybe they're an approach that's really considered in terms of what data is being touched and what types of activities are being automated.
So there's a lot of, I think, decisions that get then made along the entire sort of value chain you just described. One of the issues I've been tracking around sort of related topics recently is just, are we reaching a world in which, because AI is not just being used by the individual companies in their talent process, it's being used in all of the vendors that increasingly they're using to support those talent processes. And it's also being used by the workforce themselves, including candidates who might come along to be hired in that talent acquisition process. And for all those reasons, almost paradoxically, there's a decreasing trust of all of the various data that's collected in kind of the entirety of the talent lifecycle, before, during, and after someone's working for your organization. But all that to say, we have a lot of decisions to make. That's where I started. A lot of decisions to make regarding our talent. That speaks to one of your other predictions, which is just all things talent intelligence, the tasks that we would want to do in order to be able to make better decisions with regards to our talent. How are talent intelligence tasks being prioritized? How are we using that to enhance how we connect work to worker, workforce to what we as organizations need in the jobs that we require to generate the outcome that we're trying to generate for our stakeholders and investors and so on.
When we talk talent intelligence, I do like to recalibrate on our operating definition here because people can think about it in different ways. And in the report and the way that we think about and advise clients today is the strategic use of workforce and labor market data to enhance workforce management processes and make informed decisions. All of the factors that come into play there. Truly, how are we being smart with our available talent? Now, we know that talent intelligence plays a crucial role in enhancing workforce alignment, as you described, David, between jobs and work to be done and the actors in our workforce that can do that work. But instead of organizing that by job titles, organizations, we predict, will continue to focus on workforce and labor market data applied to the right work executors based on the tasks of the work, not the roles or the titles of their job descriptions. And it was a previous episode of this podcast, we heard from one talent intelligence solution provider that thinks about decoupling work into tasks in the same way we think about the workforce into the skills that they offer. So you'll see a theme in our report as we talk about the evolution of trends from one year to the next. And in this space around talent intelligence, we know and advise a lot of clients today on how to become skills-based organizations. That's tying skills as the unit of measurement, the unit of analysis across talent processes, whether that be the hiring and the talent acquisition scenario we talked about earlier, whether that be performance feedback, or in even some exploring case capabilities, skills-based compensation strategies. Now, while that is very aspirational and many companies today are still challenged by the ways that they're keeping their skills data relevant, up to date, assessed accurately, we're coupling that with a reason to look at the same type of analysis, but for work to be done, down to that task level. So we're looking at tools that reassess work by roles, common tasks, and subtasks to understand what are the elements of those tasks, and then what are the details around it. What work can be done by existing workforce today, what needs to be new talent that's hired or developed within our organizations, or what can be offloaded to agentic AI capabilities that we've been talking about, generative AI, digital workers. Those are all components of a longer-term workforce planning strategy that takes into account all of the talent experiences that are referenced in organizations today.
David, do you mind if I jump in on this one?
By all means.
It's absolutely fascinating, right? Because Matt kind of highlighted skills and it still has a time and place because it's really good for labor census and kind of supply and demand, right? How do I go find people that have X? The piece that people, I'm not sure, are understanding the scale of the issue is, our research is showing over 47% of jobs can be materially redesigned or need to be materially redesigned with AI. Well, that is one of the largest work redesigns that we as an industrial nation have ever seen, right? Just to give it a sense of what this looks like. And the key is you can't use skills for work redesign. You have to have task. This is where we're going to have a really interesting couple of years because, David, you and I lived this. A couple of years ago, it was where do we put skills data, right? What is a skill? Where do you put it? What's the taxonomies, right? Where does all that look like? And, the providers over time, the HCMs, the learning systems, the talent intelligence systems, all, had ways of storing skills data and passing skills data back and forth via API. We're now back at the exact same issue, which is where are we getting task data? And there's kind of a void in the market. This is where Deloitte's workforce analyzer is so important because we can actually take jobs, take it down to the task, subtask level, what can be robots, done by robots and AI. But we still have some of those fundamental issues of what's this mean from an HR tech perspective, right? And that's going to be really important because at the same time we have a little bit of a technology gap, because I'm only aware of one provider in the entire market that really is kind of a quote unquote system of record for tasks, is we as HR are going to have to be doing more work redesign than we've ever done as a profession. I fully expect and hope that we see more companies quickly trying to figure out how we do the same thing with skills that we did with tasks. It should be fun to see what happens over the next, probably 6 months on this in terms of, do we start seeing more startups or some of the bigger players adding task data schemas?
to pick up a little bit on the sort of looking backwards to look forwards that you're talking to with skills. I've long held that a lot of the reasons why very well-trodden processes in HR, like performance management, for example, have continued to be kind of almost cyclical, and just we've yet to crack that particular nut. And we kind of go through periods where we focus on it and then we kind of get tired of it and we just sort of go back to doing what we've always been doing. And a few years again, we'll come back around and try and reinvent it, et cetera. But the challenge has actually always been in that, and in, I think, skills and everything you're describing, is that we're not very good at actually breaking work down to connect work to worker. We're not very good at actually unpacking work to truly understand how it's done and done well. And that's just even looking at current work, let alone, as you're talking about, being able to try to redesign it for a new world, redesign it to use these new technologies and so forth. And so, I mean, we see that right now playing out in all of the commentary going on in the market right now with regards to AI and the return on investment in AI. I think everybody, oddly enough, seems to know what needs to get done, which is that redesign. That work design is a prerequisite for getting the value out of AI. But most investments still are kind of a traditional tech investment, which is we'll just spend money on it, we'll throw it into the organization and hope it works, versus actually stopping to do that design. And what I love about this prediction is what you're basically saying, especially with regards to the alignment of work and worker, there's reason to believe now that maybe we can use the technology to do a bit of that work design bottom up. Because quite frankly, the top-down version of work design wasn't working so well. So I'm with you. I'm excited to see how that plays out. That gets us, into the organization itself. The predictions we've talked about so far have been, I would describe them as sort of how the organization is approaching these problems. The last prediction I want to focus on is kind of from the worker's point of view, what's in it for them? And that is the prediction around personalized work technologies. So tell me, if I'm a worker in an organization, what's in it for me? How are these new tools going to come and make my life better? Why is this important? How will work technologies personalize the value that I get from my organization and how I do work and so on? Franz, I'll start with you.
I want Matt to jump in on this one too, because it's a fascinating one, because it's, like every morning many folks know, I mean, I read all the research articles and I do a lot of HR reading early in the morning. Well, now I've added to that where I talk to a generative AI system. And it's amazing how much it can teach you, right? I mean, it just flabbergasted me. I mean, I had, a conversation with the AI last week on quantum mechanics and teleportation and really how it worked, right? And because I understood the words, but didn't understand the concept. And then it took it down to a third grade level and walked me through it. And you're hearing other firms where employees are using the tools and technologies in very interesting ways, where it can help them be better, faster, more efficient in terms of what they're doing, right? The note-taking, things along those lines. I mean, I think it's going to be, how fast can the organizations build trust around it, right? In terms of, the cybersecurity, the permissioning. It is amazing to watch the capabilities, and I think it's going to be the org appetite, at least my perspective is, on how fast this can move. Matt, I mean, what do you think?
A little bit of the same, Franz, as you share your story of your morning routine with a large language model. I think that's something more and more of the workforce is becoming comfortable with, using generative AI in their daily tasks, seeing prescribed meeting minutes, getting agendas pre-generated for conversations based on who are the participants and who are the last points of tracked conversations between them. These are really intuitive things that are becoming more familiar in the flow of our work. But what we're excited to see in this prediction is how is it actually becoming more human in its relationship? So how are we, to your example, sharing the preferred explanation style at the level we want to engage with? Is that explain it to me like I'm a fifth grader? Is that engage with me in a scholarly conversation to help me refine my articulation of a specific concept? Those are prompt engineering tactics that we expect the workforce to get better at doing as they get more practice with it. But we also expect to see the technology itself become more intuitive as well. So intuitive and human, how are we seeing not just generative content, but even digital representations of our workers? Think like avatars and creative personalities in a workforce setting representing our image and likeness, and not just in visual identity, but also in our mannerisms, the word choices that we have, the generated prompts that show up in response to email conversations or chat. Like those are things that can be increasingly tied to your specific user preferences. And that brings up a lot of interesting questions where I again want to carry this forward to say, well, how much of our work persona, not just our work, do we leave behind in an organization when and as we leave them too?
We've talked in a few places in past reports, whether that's human capital trends or otherwise, around the notion of the digital doppelganger, which I think is what one of the things you're talking to. And it sort of picking up on something Franz said too. There's personally, as somebody who pays a lot of attention to learning technologies, the notion of the personal learning assistant is not a new concept. It's been around for a while. But now suddenly with AI and with agents, you can see how what was one-time science fiction, going back to, for those, I'll date myself, to Bit in Tron in the 80s, to Cortana in video games more modern, this notion that you would have a personal agent following you around that would know what you're doing, know where you are, know what you need, and actually try to help you solve whatever puzzles are in front of you. We're right there, right? It's now possible. But Franz hinted at one of the kind of key blockers, which is the data security and privacy piece. Because if I have this doppelganger that's tracking everything about me, it's also a potential data privacy risk. There's also a tremendous amount of surveillance theoretically involved in that. But if we can get past that surveillance problem, then you could just imagine how much that's a force multiplier for every individual in the organization. It's a fairly amazing concept. And with that, I think that's a great place, sort of tease for audience. Go read the report, go dig in, and obviously come back to us listeners afterwards and tell us what you think. We've talked to 4 of the predictions. There are others. But I want to leave the last word for my guests, Matt and Franz. Franz, starting with you, then Matt, just concluding thoughts that you would suggest our listeners do with regards to it.
And David, first of all, we always appreciate the opportunity to be on the show, so thank you. I think the biggest thing when at least for me, when I stepped back and looked at the predictions, and it wasn't intentional, we just kind of do them and it kind of panned out this way, is this year is less about new tech. It's more about how the work is being done. Almost every one of them involves redoing the work in some way, right? In order to do agentic, you're going to have to figure out how the work is going to be done, right? Task, you're going to have to do redesign. So it really was kind of interesting to go, actually, most of the tech predictions are more about it's going to be a catalyst that we are going to have to do more HR in a very good way. It's going to be a fun time to be in HR for the next couple of years.
And Franz, I think I'll land us in a similar sentiment. And I'll always default to the wisdom that the best HR tech is the one that the workforce actually uses. So in the context of this report, we're obviously talking about shiny objects, new capabilities, evolved capabilities on the market. But to your point on where work is being done and redone, we're not talking about bells and whistles. We're talking about investments that should be made in order to prioritize where the biggest challenges are. If that's efficiency and productivity, we can look to the AI capabilities around augmentation automation. If it's inventorying workforce capabilities and work capabilities, we look to our skills, our tasks, our talent intelligence. And if that's improving the workforce experiences, we didn't talk about it today, but not just the personalization aspect, but also micro listening and focusing on team and work group and work unit specifics. Those are where the tie-ins have to happen. So appreciate the chance as well, David, to share in this recurring series with the Capital H podcast listeners, and look forward to continuing to engage with our audience in the context of this report.
That seems like a great place to end. A big thank you to both Franz and Matt for joining us today, sharing your insights on the intersections of humans and technology. Listeners, thank you for joining us as well. Please do go check out the report. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you found us. You can also track us down on social media. We'd love to hear from you. And join us next time as we talk about making work better for humans and humans better at work. Until then, I'm David Mallon. Stay curious. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.